Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to join the Talks About Architecture series. And we want to thank Robert Jan and Sander and the Architecture Institute Rotterdam for inviting us. So I'm Daniel Norell.
Hi, everyone. I'm Einar Rodhe.
So we're Norell Rodhe. We're a small practice in Stockholm. And for the last 5 years, our studio has been in an atelier that we share with artist Helene Schmitz. Our studio is a place where we work, where we draw, write, make things, and so on. So it's a place for production, like a workshop, but it's also, in a sense, an archive of old models, for instance. And as the world went crazy last year, our studio has, through the Zoom window, increasingly become part of the schools where we teach. When we started the practice a few years ago, we taught together at the KTH. But since quite some time, I am teaching at Chalmers in Gothenburg and Einar at Konstfack here in Stockholm. In addition, our studio is becoming a storage depot for used materials that we temporarily assemble in the studio before shipping them off. So here you see materials for an installation that opens soon at the Bildmuseet at Umeå University in northern Sweden. And today we would like to talk about how much our work lately has revolved around issues of reuse, appropriation, and architecture that departs from existing objects and situations. But before going there, first a bit of background.
Okay, so taking part in exhibitions and publications has become an integrated part of our practice. It's a way for us to formulate ideas in dialogue with other practices, theorists, curators, and other disciplines. And perhaps this is also one of the reasons why we're interested in architectural representation. So how to convey architecture across media, such as, let's say, drawings, photographs, texts, models, mock-ups, and of course, buildings. And this interest in representation may seem at odds with a focus on the material realities of architecture. But as we will argue, this does not have to be the case, let's say. So draw objects, materialities, and building parts can be a way to lend them agency in the design process. It's a first step towards putting issues like reuse or appropriation on the agenda. And this is something we explored in this project here. Along with 12 other practices, we were invited to take part in an exhibition in Malmö in southern Sweden that kind of looked at small interventions for a new neighborhood. And we proposed a series of small bookable rooms, mainly for displaying used goods on sale, from, let's say, vehicles to furniture to objects, but also for social activities, such as a temporary gallery or a dinner party. And it was not so much the framework that provided by the structure that interested us, but the objects and activities that would dwell in it. And we imagine how sort of, let's say, the colorful masses of objects could form a landscape of compression and expansion, where spaces are defined by stuff on display, a live interior, constantly in production as new objects come and go. And we thought about this structure as being almost like a construction site, where you kind of pass by on a daily basis and where there's a continuous ongoing process. And our hope with this little project was that unexpected adjacencies between different objects and activities could stir conversations and exchange between residents and visitors. In many projects, we have been interested in challenging the idea that spaces and drawings should precede matter in the design process. So rather than designing something on the drawing board and then kind of adding materiality and specifications, we would first go and look for materials and building elements that have an interesting material quality and then depart from them. So using standard Leka blocks here as a starting point, this small project for a set of furniture combines, let's say, the refined and the primitive. And the uncut blocks give the pieces a set of proportions and make them appear inert, massive, and porous, quality that not normally would be associated with furniture. And together, the various furniture, such as a kind of stepped display unit, podiums, a table, etc., start to define a group of architectural elements. And from this early work came an interest in architecture as an assemblage, or a group of elements or masses. And here's our entry for the Schlefter Cultural Center. It became a kind of opportunity to explore this. This project was done sort of in the same time or immediately after. And fittingly, the premise of the competition was that the city wanted to collect several existing cultural institutions into one major hub for culture and events. And here we see these institutions interpreted as separate building blocks and then kind of put together into a supergroup. So each building mass in the center we designed corresponds to one of the existing institutions in the town. There's a theater, that's what's in green here in the image, a library rotunda, art galleries in red, etc., as well as kind of a new hotel tower and a conference center. And they're all arranged on a plinth that faces adjacent public spaces. So it's a group form or an assembly approach, and that's interesting to us in this work because it allows for multiple identities and productive adjacencies and overlaps in between programs. And it also resulted in this almost Pyrenean interior, an urban condition, junctions, piazzas, landmarks. It's an interior city consisting solely of tightly packed architecture. And here's the first floor plan, theaters, auditoria, upper foyers, etc. And unfortunately, this was not a competition we won, but the project ended up gracing the facade of the Rudolf Hall at the Yale School of Architecture for an exhibition called Adjacencies. Here's a recent competition we actually did win for an observation tower in Latvia. And our proposal, it stands like a kind of friendly figure in the landscape of a nature reserve, looking out at various surrounding scenes. And the tower consists of a vertical gridded framework that scaffolds a series of discrete architectural features, dramatically kind of cantilevering from it. It's again a project that begins as an assemblage of parts or feature of objects. And each feature, or let's say add-on, directs views to a particular vista of the surrounding landscape. Tiny openings in the size of postcards frame details of a picturesque village scene at the sort of bottom center. An expansive oculus window directs views towards the vast woodlands, and let's say I am flying balcony offers a panorama some 30 meters above ground. And the varying views, they turn the visitor's promenade towards the top into a continuously unfolding narrative that links the specificity of the North Vidsimia landscape and the tower. And we like to think about this journey to the top as an exposition of ever-changing vistas, here illustrated with collages of historical landscape paintings. And here, yeah, the same sort of viewing devices in planar view. And the tower, it becomes almost a viewing machine, a vertical collection of framing devices such as balconies and directed openings. And here, seen from a distance, coming closer.
So now on to a few examples of private residences that we have been working on lately. Several of these residences are houses that explore a kind of playful monumentality through things like composition, proportion, and fenestration. So the question can be, how can you make something that's relatively small, like a 120 square meter house, seem big and significant? We often consider a distinct massing where the house becomes an object, like a discrete entity in the landscape. And as it says in Swedish on this image, this is the house for the old chicken lady. It's a very basic traditional log cabin, but with its roof and symmetry, it has the quality of a small temple almost. So when a client asked us to replace this house with a new villa, we instead proposed an extension. The new house, that's actually much larger than the chicken house, gently touches the chicken house just enough to make a connection. Along with the third building, they shape a series of outdoor spaces, a recessed entrance place to the street and a loggia-like facade to the west, that mirrors an existing trellis structure. So here's the street facade with an old mansion in the background to which the chicken house once belonged. So the new house becomes like a slightly larger sibling to the chicken house. And here we see also how the site slopes towards a deep bay of the Baltic Sea. And the interior with a view towards the garden. And here the slope where the building stands on stilts. And interior walls were rendered in clay, allowing for soft and filleted corners. Like most architects, we're often asked to do magic with a small budget. This is a summer house for a young family who had bought a small lot just south of Stockholm in a pastoral landscape characterized by mixed forest and open fields. So to increase a sense of privacy in relation to the neighbors, we proposed 2 walls on the site. One actual wall to the left in the plan and one wall-like house to the right. And in between these 2 walls shape a garden that's shielded from views. In front of the house, there is a veranda configured as an open loggia to the garden and a small circular patio on the back of the house. The interior is essentially one elongated space that's loosely divided into social and private spaces that extend onto the veranda, spanning the full length of the house. The exterior has an expressive rhythm of posts and raft details against which there is a play of differently shaped geometrical openings. And working with these kinds of houses is an ongoing work in progress for us. We enjoy designing them as it's often a sort of quick process where one can potentially pack a lot of architecture into a small envelope. So here we see an axon that shows the interior and how it's an assemblage of masses that establishes a sequence of spaces. So approaching the site, the house appears as a small pitched gable that sits atop a gently sloping hill facing a field. And here the gable, moving up the hill and into the garden, reveals the main facade fronted by the veranda. And the veranda creates a backdrop against which domestic life and games and play, as well as the vegetation on the site, unfolds. On a rainy day like this one, the veranda becomes an in-between space where you can enjoy the garden through a curtain of water thanks to the gutterless roof. When one steps into the house, the sense of order that the facade brings is loosened. So the interior is essentially one long open space that has been furnished with smaller monomaterial masses. And together with shifts in floor level, these masses loosely define rooms. And the rooms are strung together by a passage and a sightline that spans the full 20-meter length of the house. Openings on both gables extend views towards, on one side, the garden, and to the other side, back across the field from which one entered the site. Here's the living room with sliding doors to the parents' bedroom. And when the doors slide, they reveal another color and another materiality of the wall behind them. And here, just a couple of details of electricity outlets that are hidden in the floor and the sliding door. The view back across the field. And the view in the other direction. We also sometimes design apartments and interiors, and most buildings in the center of Stockholm are built between 1880 and 1970. So there's often a historical aspect to take into account, even in the interior. And this project reconfigures a 1920s apartment in central Stockholm as a central living space that extends into adjacent rooms to form a sequence. And 2 new sets of furnishings articulate passages and views between these rooms. On one side, the kitchen is recessed behind a bookshelf and a freestanding counter. On the other side, a bench has sunken into the wall, creating a window that frames views between social and private spheres. And there's a curtain that may be drawn to provide privacy when wanted. And together, these spatial relations makes the room seem spacious and varied despite the relatively modest size. The family that we designed this for grew, and they now moved into a new apartment that we're currently working with them on. It's located on one of Stockholm's main squares in a 1910s building, with quite a bit of articulation in the interior and things like reliefs, profiled moldings, etc. So with this type of work, there is often a request from the client to rethink the space plan so that it better suits life of today. And for instance, that adapts an old layout with a small kitchen and a big living room to a more contemporary layout. And we often find ourselves trying to negotiate that while somehow paying attention to or amplifying the character of the existing architecture and interior details. So here we see how kitchen and living room is merged into one through the removal of a wall, but we also keep part of the wall and part of the panel moldings and even the door below the bench.
Okay, so for some time now, we have been interested in how architecture can come about by collecting, altering, and recombining existing things. It has to do with our interest in representation of architecture. How can we harvest and mediate qualities of existing things and buildings through means of representations? And how can used objects become the actual building blocks of architecture? They have an interest, let's say, in things that starts from other things. So this project, titled Dead Ringers, was born from an interest in Stockholm's smallest public buildings, like phone booths, restroom kiosks, and photo booths. And these urban kiosks are rapidly being outmoded and removed from the city's streets and squares without anyone really noticing it, let's say. And a few years ago, we noted that the telephone booths were removed, let's say for obvious reasons. So we started to document the range of kiosks in Stockholm based on photographs as well as archived drawings. We became almost obsessed with the kind of anthropomorphic proportions of these little figurative buildings. So if you look at this drawing, you can see how at the turn of the last century, some kiosks featured shingle-clad pitched roofs and slender legs, while more recent ones read as monolithic, with kind of boxy volumes made from formed metal panels and glass. But what ties them all together, despite stylistic differences, is the fact that they were all kind of shaped around the human body. So we used the documentation as a direct starting point for the design of a set of new strange copies of the disappearing kiosks. So here is one of our dead ringers seen in 3 different elevations. It's a building with kind of fronts all around it, where each of the fronts reveal a different character. And perhaps we could say that our take on frontality has been influenced by the great work of Bernd and Hilla Becher. And through their lenses, anonymous industrial architecture and infrastructures are turned into monumental solitary figures. The series of images shown in this slide kind of circle around one tower, showing the importance of kind of proportions and posture in relation to a building's character. So in frontal view, the building makes eye contact with the beholder. It's almost after it's a kind of dialogue starting between us and the building. And then in other views, we are just mute spectators. And our dead ringers, like the original kiosks, would be visible as small characters in the urban fabric. But unlike their ideally proportioned forefathers, they would be kind of disfigured, loop-sided, weirdly kind of postured. And the project eventually made its way into an exhibition called Public Luxury at Architectuur, Sweden's National Center for Architecture and Design. And here's a view from the exhibition where the silhouette of the kiosk almost kind of correspond to one of the original kiosks that the piece was based on. And we like the fact that in some views, part of the overall form seemed to kind of fall into the projection plane of a facade, whereas in other views, the form kind of break or twist out of from the very same plane. It's a play between 2D elevation and frontality and three-dimensional mass. And a quick shot from the opening night. We quite like this view of the dead ringer standing like a majestic figure in a sea of people. And for a brief moment, the dead ringer we designed also stepped out from the museum and into the urban fabric of Stockholm. And in this work, formal features from the original kiosks were translated into a new massing via drawings. So the final piece is, in a way, a full-scale representation of the originals. But what we would like to move into now is a talk about how a more literal reuse can happen, where actual found objects and chunks of materials are harvested and assembled into new structures. Yeah, and this is current work. It's a research-based or a practice-based research project titled Interiors Matter that studies the life cycles of interiors, furniture, and building elements. And the project includes a series of furniture that gathers material and parts from different realms, let's say. And our experience is that there is often an element of serendipity when designing with existing things that are appropriated for other purposes. So in this table, the strip light fixtures, for example, had detailing and technical parts, let's say, that become unhooked from function and meaning. So in the table, one could argue that the detailing acquires a new significance. When we were assembling these chairs from found various metal objects, including a structure from an existing chair, the question of authorship became apparent. So without really knowing so, the structure was from a chair designed in the 90s by a close colleague of mine at the university where I teach, Jonas Ostlund. So in the end, who is the author of this chair? Is it us who just quickly arranged some metal plates to a structure, or is it perhaps him that designed this V structure? In the novel Invisible Cities, Italo Calvino elaborates on a city called Clarice, where the same building elements are continuously rearranged on an urban scale. And he says, the capitals could have been in the chicken runs before they were in the temples. The marble urns could have been planted with basil before they were filled with dead bones. Only this is known for sure. A given number of objects is shifted within a given space, at times submerged by a quantity of new objects, at times worn out and not replaced. The rule is to shuffle them each time and then try to assemble them again. And based on his text, we made a small model for an exhibition in Italy a few years ago. And in order to situate us within Calvino's Clarice, we went on a scavenger hunt in our studio, collecting the tiniest and most beautiful small objects that we could find and try to assemble them into a new facade. And recently we received an invitation to design and install a large-scale version of this piece for an exhibition at Bildmuseet in northern Sweden. So what if architecture, with its convention of strong part-to-whole relationships, would be developed using discrete objects from radically different origins? And to us, perhaps even more concrete, how can we translate this little model into a large-scale structure? So we are currently developing this colossal model of the same facade, but now made with used building elements found in demolition sites, markets for used materials, and recycling centers throughout Stockholm. And when assembled, they form a structure based on a 1 by 1 meter grid. And based on their qualities such as, let's say, materiality, color, scale, patina, etc., a loose associative order is being developed. And it's a 5 meter tall structure, which is still then titled Clarice. and it's currently being installed at the museum in an exhibition titled Architecture of Transition, and it's curated by Pedro Gadano and Anders Jansson. And working with non-standard objects as building components, an obvious issue is, at least in this project, was that all details were unique and had to be custom designed. And this taxonomy is a part of a set of construction documents developed for the project. It shows how widely different elements and chunks of materials must come together. And here these are planar cuts through the columns. So the city is filled with stuff, of objects and architecture. How can a close look at such extant material, the way it's used, its genesis and its varying temporality, as well as the flows that supports it, how can this be turned into a proposition for architecture that takes these aspects into account? And to what extent can one design, or let's say design one piece of architecture that incorporates elements from radically different origins and still makes sense as a whole? Here a glimpse of the work in progress from the museum. So one of the things we wanted to do with this kind of projects is to understand where elements and materials go when buildings come to an end. So since some years ago, we have been doing a series of excursions and scavenger hunts where we visit demolition sites, outlets for used building elements, recycling centers, active landfills, etc., to talk to people working in this kind of flow of used materials. And on such visits, we often collect used materials such as concrete rubble, plastics, bits of plasterboards, steel studs, etc. And here are two markets for used building elements that we will find locally in Stockholm. And these two spaces are fascinating to us, but in different ways. They are both kind of densely packed with architectural elements, but their atmospheres are radically different. So one being nostalgic with aged objects in an old barn with dimmed lighting, and the other is much more kind of straightforward and rational, filled with standard products from metal and plastic. And during our kind of trips around mapping this flow of used objects, a demolition worker told us that building elements that are valued today, that's those who are either really old, let's say 100 years plus, or very young, less than 5 years. So patina and craftsmanship are interesting, and being fresh is valuable. But the rest, what makes up most of the built environment kind of around us, has no real value once it's installed, still, let's say. And here's an active landfill south of Stockholm, where building parts and other waste material are buried deep underground. It once was a strip mine, and now this, let's say, wound in the landscape is being concealed gradually with garbage. So the waste is protected with a waterproof layer below. That's what's just is about to happen here. And then they would add all the waste and a waterproof layer above as well. And we saw this as almost like a wrapping gift to future generations. And this is not an archive photo. This is an ongoing practice still.
So for the 2019 Architecture Triennial in Oslo, we developed a project called Under Construction, where we, inspired by the Italo Calvino text, started to imagine a 100% reused city that's neither dystopic nor futuristic in its character. The project emerges as a playful fiction with immediate ties to the grit of the real world, where the city becomes an archive of stuff, continuously transforming in slow motion as building elements are reused in new buildings. So giving materials and building elements a second life is, of course, a logistical challenge. It's a problem of procurement, codes, and material flows. And sometimes those problems seem to be, or those challenges seem to be almost impossible to overcome. But as architects, we realize that the problem is as much of a cultural and designerly nature. And one of the most persistent architectural conventions is to consider abstract space before material entities. So building elements and materials are supposed to be subservient to a larger whole. And if you think about it, this approach is aligned with the view of the world that's inherited from industrialism, in which materials could be sourced anew and molded into shape indefinitely. So in the design of under construction, we flipped the design process around and departed from an already established stock of materials. So objects and chunks of materials takes priority over organization and composition. And in addition, each piece for reuse comes with a set of qualities, a character that we can identify, amplify, subvert, or alter. The under construction neighborhood centers around a local market crowned by a soft sculptural roof or a porcelain sink, depending on the gaze of the viewing subject. And as a further response to principles of reuse and recycling, each one of the 5 houses in the neighborhood is constructed from a single type of material. This mono-material approach corresponds to thinking of materials in terms of fractions throughout their life cycle, something that significantly increases the possibilities for future disassembly and reuse. So each building becomes a temporary depot of material, which later can be rearranged into something else. And we should also say that these buildings were a way for us to playfully cycle through a bunch of references that we have in common. So here, for instance, metal light diffusers and some anti-dove spikes are arranged to form an almost John Haydock-like character of a building. Here, used plasterboard becomes concrete slabs. Or here, plastic panels are repurposed as giant, thick waffle slabs, much like in Toyo Ito's Sendai Mediatek, but with quite a different flavor still. Or here, wooden panel moldings are reconfigured as big slabs, almost as if they were reused concrete sections. Together, the buildings form a fictional neighborhood complete with streets and plazas. And one of the aims of the project was to have the design and the construction of the model, even though it's just a model, be a result of a direct interaction with the material flows that the project seeks to address. There is, of course, obviously a play with representation going on here. Qualities belonging to the collected pieces of material, such as materiality and patina, reinforce a reading of them as real and undisguised, while the scale of the model makes clear that they should simultaneously be read as representing something other than themselves. So the last Oslo Triennale was themed the architecture of degrowth, where in Robang, the curators explored the idea of degrowth to limit endless extraction of materials and natural resources. So the question at large was, how does architecture respond to that in terms of models of practice, aesthetics, and urban life, etc.? So when you're in school, you constantly receive feedback on your work. In practice, we have found that those valuable moments of exchange, when you get focused commentary from friends and from peers, are much more rare. So when we had the opportunity to exhibit under construction in a local architecture gallery in Stockholm, where we are based, we invited friends, colleagues, and critics to a seminar where we discussed the work and the issues that it raises. And this became a way for us to build discourse on reuse and appropriation and advance our positions. Such discourse can, of course, be linked to the past, and architecture has a rich history of design that departs from a used stock of materials. This has been especially true for pre-modern and post-modern times. So spoliation, the appropriation and reuse of antique building elements, was common during the Middle Ages. And in the late 1960s, architecture theorist Charles Jenks coined the term ad hocism that came to be associated with a quirky practice of appropriation. These historical practices establish precedents for a process that has inspired us, in which the act of design unfolds in an encounter with a specific and limited stock of materials. So the medieval use of reclaimed building elements from Roman and Greek times has often been seen as a misuse, since the classical ideals and orders were not followed. But some art historians have instead argued that the use of spolia amounted to an alternative order, as we can see in this slide, that was based on a new aesthetic bias for diversity and patterning. This might be an important reminder for us today that to support a more sustainable use of materials, we might have to rethink our aesthetic preferences. So sustainability is, in this sense, very much a cultural and architectural endeavor and problem. In pursuing work of this kind, we have noted that used building elements often have qualities and dimensions that resist standard means of architectural representation and production. Here are a few slides from a recent research project titled Completions that outlines an approach to reuse where building elements are integrated into new assemblies by means of 3D scanning and fabrication. So the project surveys and completes, or let's say repairs, elements found in a state of disrepair with new adjoining parts. And based on this idea, we developed 3 pieces that used salvaged building elements: a window frame to the left, a door in the middle, and a mantelpiece or fireplace to the right. In the project, we explored how the exactitude and rich materiality of models obtained with scanning can provide an alternative to the abstraction that comes with typical CAD drawings. The scanning process, unlike the eye of a human conducting a manual survey, does not discriminate between what has been intentionally designed and what's circumstantial, such as the patina in this old window frame. It simply captures an object in the state it was found in, including color and texture. And we argue that this ability to see objects devoid of human preconception resonates with a speculative reuse practice. So in this sense, scanning can distance an object from its original context and function, and thereby open up alternative possibilities for use as well as for interpretation. Taking cues from spolia and ad hocism, the completions lie somewhere in between dutiful repairment and an exquisite corpse. So here, the completed window frame where 2 of the sawn-off ends are effortlessly bridged.
One could question whether that's effortlessly.
Hopefully it looks effortless, at least. But there's quite a bit of work behind it, of course. By playing with straight edges and fractured edges of leftover marble sheets, like a puzzle almost, these fragments of marble form a grotto-like mantelpiece. And here a detail where the edge of one stone is cut with a water jet to match the randomly fractured edge of another, so that they magically lock into each other. Here, a double door where the wear and tear of an original door to the left is transferred into a matching new piece on the right by means of scanning and fabrication. And so thanks to the symmetry between the old and the new, the accidental character of the spots of worn-off paint and the patina shifts so that they start to read as almost intentional articulation. And we're currently developing these completions into a room-size installation that's set in a near future where the combination of automation and resource scarcity has reversed the current relations between craft, which today is expensive, and materials, which today are cheap.
Okay, we wanted to end this talk with a recent project that builds on this thinking in a much more casual way. So if you look close enough, very few buildings are static. Here's an historical survey of an old Navy building in Stockholm. It was built as a small single storage in the early 18th century. That's what's in dark gray here in the image. And it has since kind of grown gradually in all directions. We feel for this building. It tries to look kind of proper and proud, But if you pay attention, you will see conflicts and negotiations all over. In the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm, they asked us to transform the ground floor of this building into their new home for students and faculty working with photography, moving images, and performance art. So here the exterior, as it stands today, it has a kind of strong sense of unity that disguises the fact that it's a building and that's almost an assemblage of extensions. And Stockholm, it's a city on islands. The Royal Institute of Art is located on Skeppsholmen, once dedicated to shipbuilding, now home to several cultural institutions such as the Museum of Modern Art, as well as the Royal Institute of Art. And after suffering from a big fire a few years ago, the institute is now growing and it's using the building stock on the island. And the island then becomes a campus for the institute. So the building we are working with is on the sort of top here in black, whereas the main building is on the south end. Our transformation treats the building as a found object, and the design, it aims at turning old accidents, let's say, into architecture. So, for example, in the 19th century, someone added a support structure as the building was growing vertically, with kind of raised timber posts placed in front of the windows. So this drawing shows how we insert a new partition wall to create seminar rooms, and how this wall becomes a backdrop for the posts, projecting the window layout of the front facade just onto it. And the project responded to a new, less hierarchical model for art education developed by the Institute, where faculty, students, workshop staff, etc., are grouped around the subject of study rather than based on their academic rank. So here we have discursive spaces, let's say seminar rooms to the bottom of the plan, and then spaces for production just next to them on the top. And solving circulation was tricky, since we weren't allowed to make new openings larger than 5 centimeters in the load-bearing walls for preservation reasons. Okay, we started the project with an inventory of the spaces, as well as other hidden resources at the Institute. So to the left, you can see some of the timber posts, which we wanted to kind of unclutter and emphasize. The image in the middle, that's a set of beautiful chairs in the school's extensive warehouse, once designed for students working in their ateliers by Karin Norell. That was on a time when the sort of majority of students still were kind of painting on canvases. And scouting the Institute, we also found some old stonework that could be reused as a table. And most of the photographs here were taken by our friend Mikael Olsson just before the school opened. But being an art school, the rooms are now gradually transforming beyond our control.
This is a faculty and student lounge. It's essentially a loosely programmed space for spontaneous work, lunches, coffee, conversation, and social and discursive spaces like this, where students and faculty were to meet, were in fact an important part of the brief. Here, the professor, for instance, organizes lunches once a month for staff and students, where they cook together while discussing specific and sometimes controversial topics. And in addition, we designed a series of furniture pieces that were especially made for the project, including this greenish concrete table.
Here, a quick mock-up to test different proportions. The final table was casted by a local concrete artist, and we were able to kind of be there during the casting, adding kind of the greenish pigment manually until the tone was just right. And it's a fascinating process because nothing happens for a while, and then all of a sudden, the color kind of blooms through very clearly.
Adjacent to the lounge that we just looked at, there is a kitchenette clad in stainless steel and a recessed shelf that was tailored to the existing timber post. So it's again this idea that existing and new negotiate with each other and complete each other. Circulation spaces without daylight were painted in a hue that works well in shadowy conditions. And here we see also the student lockers.
And throughout the project, most surfaces were clad in standard materials. It's a not so high budget thing. But we developed this kind of color scheme to give more of specificity to the rooms and structures. Here kind of shown in model.
Spaces for production that are located towards the back of the building included a combined library and project room, basically a large atelier for group work.
Yeah, here one can see sort of an overhead crane that was left from the Navy. So in some room, we can opt for flexibility through movable furniture and installations. And then in other spaces, it was kind of key to stick to something more robust that could not be moved at all, such as the green concrete table.
Here, a niche in the faculty lounge with a bespoke unit for books and storage that's fitted to the niche. So the project overall transforms the existing interior through many small and precise additions, like this one, rather than through a material and budget-intensive transformation of the building as a whole.
Okay, here, finally, the space filled with people. It's from the inauguration that faculty, students, and guests gather around our big table just before sort of the pandemic changed everything. And this leads to a question: when does architecture start and when does it stop? We see a kind of need to consider architecture and its constituent elements and materials in a widened temporal framework, including the sourcing and processing of materials, maintenance, and how and where a building is eventually laid to rest. And this last question, along with some of the previous themes we have discussed, have to do with control and letting go, or how to integrate aspects of chance or entropy in the conception of architecture. All right, Robert, Jan, and Sander, thank you again for having us.